Well, welcome everybody, and thank you all for making it out in the weather. But maybe we're a little bit used to it right now, huh? So why don't we start out with the Pledge of Allegiance. And Michael, would you like to do the honors?
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And now we'll do introductions. Kim, would you like to begin?
Kim Ridgway, AC Transit.
Sharon Keiki, Antioch Paratransit.
Elfellow Smith, Antioch East Bay representative on the Paratransit.
Deanna Perry, Tri-Delta Transit.
Michael Daugelli, East County Paratransit.
Janet Abelson, West County Consumer.
Debbie Toth, Trace and Aging Service Provider.
Josh Sullivan, Contra Costa Developmental Disabilities Council.
Janet Bilbis, City of El Cerrito.
Peter Engel, CCTA.
Diane Bowden, CCTA.
And then Ralph? What? Yes, please. Beverly? Is your first name Beverly? Thank you. I hear you talking, but where are you? There you are. Thank you. And Rita?
Rita Xavier, Advisory Council on Aging.
And welcome. Okay, and with that, we will go ahead and get started with the public comment. So far, there's one person from the public who would like to speak on items not on the agenda. Ralph?
Ralph Hoffman from downtown Walnut Creek. And in a few months, I'm going to be turning 75 years old. And so I wanted to tell you youngsters something as far as good advice. If you're still mobile and can walk, when you get my age, my vision is worse than it used to be. My reflexes are slower. And I'm at bad risk of having a fall, which could be very injurious or even end my life if I hit my head on concrete or something. And I've had a little experience like that. So one way to avoid senior falls is by walking hands-free. And I just want to demonstrate how I'm doing this with a bag that's carrying it strapped to my head. But it's one of the many ways we can think about how to stay healthy in our older years by recognizing our disabilities increase as we age, and yet changing our lifestyle to make up for that by safer ways to be mobile. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public want to speak on items not on the agenda? Seeing none, if anyone from the public wants to speak on an item that is on the agenda, they can do so when we're talking about the items. But you're on the committee, so you're not from the public.
So, Madam Chair, just as a point of order, am I allowed to step away from the committee if I have some input not on the agenda from my stakeholder group?
Usually, isn't there a place for people on the committee to speak on items not on the agenda? Peter?
There's the news to share.
Oh, okay, there it is, yeah. Item number 12.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So with that, we will move on to the next agenda item, and it is the summary of actions, previously known as the minutes, from January 23rd. It's in your packet for you to review or make any corrections about. It's on page 7. Is there a motion?
I move that we accept the summary of actions.
Okay.
I'll second.
Okay, so motion by Rita, seconded by Kim. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposition?
Not opposition, but
Abstentions? Okay, that was the next thing. Okay, so one abstention from Michael. And with that, we'll move on to the next. So it passed, and we'll move on to the next item, which is the fiscal year 17-18 Major J Program 15 claim schedule.
So I'll just give a brief update on this. Last meeting in January, you approved the schedule. The schedule was that right about this time, I would get the projections for fiscal year 17-18. I got those late last week. We are looking at about a 2% increase in our Measure J sales tax over this last year, so that means about a 2% increase in the allocations. And it's a little bit better news for that for the program 15, which increases actually its allocation amount every year above and beyond the increase in sales tax. So last year it was a 4.2% of the total sales tax. This year it's 4.3% of the total sales tax. So it's not going to, change that 2% number. It'll go up a little bit, but not enough to make it 2.5% or anything like that. So during this week, I will be figuring out what that means to each of the operators. We put that number through a formula for each of the operators, and which is in the expenditure plan. So hopefully by early to mid next week, I will have the claims sent out to the operators in the county so they can start filling those out. And then those would need to be back at the end, April 22nd, I believe, is the date. And then we will have the review committee, which was also appointed last week. We're still trying to set up the date, and I'm going to talk to a few of you after the meeting today that are on that subcommittee to see what your schedule's like. So that's the update for that item.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from anyone? Okay, seeing none, now we'll go on to the update on Caltrans Enhanced Mobility of Seniors and Individuals with Disability Program, otherwise known as 5310 2017 cycle.
Thank you. So I do have a brief update on this as well. I just got this last week from MTC. We had 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We had 14 applications from Contra Costa, or for services in Contra Costa County. 16 total applications that were sent against the UZAs, and there was actually more than that if you count San Francisco. Oakland is a little bit different because it's San Francisco, Oakland, all of West County, and Marin County. Whereas Concord, Antioch's all in Contra Costa County. Concord is in Contra Costa County as well as the Tri-Valley area of Alameda County. So normally the Concord UZA has only had applications from Contra Costa County, but this year LAVTA Wheels did 2 applications against the Concord urbanized area. So, but what did I say? 14 applications made by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 agencies. All of the agencies were approved. Their applications, their projects were approved. some at full funding and some not quite at full funding. So a lot of that went into what they were asking for and what urbanized area they were asking for the funds in and how those funding went out. But and so what was approved was a program of projects that will now go to Caltrans for their approval. This approval level is at MTC. And Caltrans has pretty much said as long as they're an eligible agency, they will honor the requests of the region as far as programming the funds. So that's good news. So there was a total amount requested from Contra Costa of almost $3.3 million. So there wasn't quite that much funds, but there's pretty close. So it was a good cycle for Contra Costa agencies. So that's my update on that.
I have a question. I didn't quite understand that. Is it this or the last one where you were talking about the 2 urbanized areas, I thought?
The what?
2 urbanized areas? Or am I just imagining that?
So there's 3 urbanized areas that we can apply for funding in. There's the San Francisco, Oakland, which the communities in West County are part of. There's the Concord UZA, which is all of Central County and Southwest County and the Tri-Valley area, so Dublin, Pleasanton. And then there's the Antioch in East County. So Antioch, Pittsburgh, that urbanized area.
So did they compete separately in those 3 areas?
Yeah, so in East County, so if Contra Costa ARC is applying for funding for services in Antioch, they would apply in the Antioch, or the funding would come out of the Antioch urbanized area. If they're applying for funds to do services in Concord, it would come out of the Concord urbanized area.
Oh, okay. So you mentioned, I thought, how many were in the central area of the 3 areas. But I didn't
break it down by applications by area. I don't have that information.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have that. What I was trying to say was LAFTA, which is not part of Contra Costa County, applied for funds against the Concord UZA, and they haven't done that in the past. That's something new. Normally, it's just been Contra Costa agencies that have applied for those funds.
Okay. Go ahead, Debbie.
So I think it's a good point to bring up that an area outside of Contra Costa is applying for funds inside of Contra Costa, not to be adversarial, but to look at the reasons behind that, and that is because they're stepping beyond what these fiefdoms are in our current RTPCA worlds and our joint powers of authority jurisdiction, and they're crossing a county line, oh my God, and providing a, what? Seamless trip, right? This is why they were doing it, no? I mean,
No.
This was my understanding of why they were crossing this county line so there could be a seamless trip for the writer. Is that not why that was funded?
I haven't seen. I didn't see the application, but technically the urbanized area crosses the county lines. So my understanding is they're providing paratransit service in Dublin. They're using this to provide the paratransit service for the Lyft Uber rural area service where they stop providing fixed route service. But I could be wrong. Maybe they are crossing lines, but I believe because the urbanized area crosses the county lines, it includes Dublin, Pleasanton, that they're applying for those funds for service in that area. Now, Livermore has its own, it's a small urbanized area, and it has its own pot of funds. So any services they provide in Livermore, they would use those funds for. But to provide services in, which is part of their service area, Concord, Dublin, Pleasanton is part of the LAFTA service area. They would apply for these, Concord urbanized areas.
I understood
It's similar to the San Francisco, Oakland urbanized areas. It has 3 counties involved. So, but I haven't seen the application, so I don't know exactly what they applied for. They applied for mobility management. I know what the titles are: mobility management, coordination, and operating assistance, paratransit taxi subsidy. So.
Well, that would be interesting to know. It was my understanding that we were trying to address an issue of not having riders
I'll find out
transfer
from- I'll
trips
find
at
out
that
from
point.
Drennan.
That'd be great. Thanks.
I actually thought that some of the urbanized, so-called urbanized areas were, they call small urbanized areas, I thought. In San Francisco, Bay Area, the one that crosses 3 counties, is called a large one. I don't know why specifically those words are used, but
Yes, so
I heard it called that.
yeah, so any contiguous urbanized area that has 200,000, 50,000 population to 200,000 is called a small urbanized area, and that's Livermore. And anything over 200,000 is called a large urbanized area. So because Martinez, Concord, Pleasant Hill, Walnut Creek, Danville, San Ramon, Alamo are pretty much a solid population base. They consider that a contiguous population. Dublin, it just kind of goes across county lines. That's considered one urbanized area, and they just call it the Concord urbanized area. That's why San Francisco, Oakland, it's called the San Francisco, Oakland urbanized area, but it also includes West Contra Costa County. It includes Marin County, because they don't count the water. I mean, they just look at the total population that's contiguous to each other, and then below $50,000 is a rural area. So those are federal designations. So when they appropriate money, they generally appropriate it by those designations.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Am I?
I don't know. Why don't you go ahead and
Am I
finish,
up?
Debbie, because you started. Oh, okay, then go ahead.
Yeah. I want to stay on this for a minute. Peter, I want to make sure I'm understanding what's happening here. Are we talking about funds, just 3.3 million funds being used to supplement services already in these areas? Or looking at, because I look at enhance to mean that you're going to add something to services in these areas. And if that's the case, then I want to put on the table again is Sunday service in the Antioch area. I will raise the issue one more time that I can't get Sunday service in my area because I live 1 mile from a fixed route bus stop. And if I go in either direction, I'm 1 mile from a fixed stop bus stop. And when I read the description on this enhanced mobility of seniors and individuals with disabilities, I left that with the understanding that these are possible funds that could be used to fund the additional Sunday services in these areas. Now, am I right or am I wrong?
You are correct. So the funds can be used, a portion of these funds can be used to provide services above and beyond what's required by the ADA. So if you want additional Sunday service in Antioch, that's the person sitting next to you, Tri-Delta Transit. Do you guys have fixed route service on Sundays?
We do, but he is outside. He's 1 mile,
Okay.
and we're
So,
3/4.
so you would need to have service above what's required by the ADA, which you're outside of, where you live outside of that service area. So these funds could be used for that. You just need to find somebody to provide the service and apply for them. And that would be a policy decision for Tri-Delta to go above and beyond what they're already doing. These funds can also be applied for by nonprofit agencies. Choice in Aging, Mobility Matters, Futures Explored, Contra Costa ARC, these are all Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired. These are all nonprofit agencies that are providing services using these funds. So if there's a nonprofit in Antioch that can operate on Sundays or wants to operate more service on Sundays, they can apply for these funds.
Go ahead, Michael.
Well, just living in that area, my only question to that would be, in terms of everybody contributing to it, being 1 mile on Sunday, but he's not 1 mile on Monday through Saturday? Just because that's where the routes go? Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we're still on this agenda item, so I don't know what you meant, Debbie, when you said you wanted to do another item, but I think you meant within this agenda item. Uh-huh.
I just meant that I wasn't going to talk further about that particular funding situation, but within this topic, this is a 3-year cycle. So now this, whenever it actually comes to fruition, because it's got to go through Caltrans and then they fund it at some point. And whenever that some point is when that 3-year contract cycle begins. In the absence of that, I have a vehicle, and let's get together and talk about what we can do on Sunday transportation. And we'll talk to the city of Antioch and the senior center and everybody else we can and see if we can't get rides for church folks on Sunday who don't fall within that.
Yeah, and I was going to say the same thing. Contra Costa ARC probably doesn't use a lot of their vehicles on Sundays as well. So we can try and see if we can get some coordination occurring.
Okay, so we are on number 6, right? Item number 6 on our agenda. Just to, right? Okay. So are there any more comments or questions on item number 6, other than I have this from the committee? Okay, not seeing any more from the committee. We have a public speaker request on this item, and it's from Ralph Hoffman.
Ralph Hoffman again. Really, that 3/4 of a mile limit, I believe, should be raised to 1.5 miles, particularly on weekends, because weekend public transportation service is so poor anyhow. But this is a national issue, and I don't want to get too much into politics, but we really need to lobby as senior citizens or disabled people to get that limit raised from 3/4 of a mile to 1.5 miles. Thank you.
The ADA is the instrument that has that regulation. So that is the federal government. So. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, forgive my ignorance, but when the ADA says 3/4 of a mile, if I were to go to whatever that 3/4 of a mile point is and have that be my pickup and drop off, I could get a ride from there, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's not a matter of where my residence is, it's a matter of where my pickup and drop off spot is that accurate?
Well, it's got nothing to do with where you live. Yes, that's accurate.
Okay,
but whether or not that you could just out in the middle of nowhere
right,
do that, I have no idea. But
right. There are other logistics. I was
but
just curious
but it
if it was tied to the
it's not
residence.
3/4 of a mile from where you live. It's the spot where you're doing the trip from. So there, you can be an ADA certified person and not be able to get an ADA trip because of where you're wanting to go and either come from or go to. I know I have that situation in my own city. A lot of meetings are held at our country club, and I can get up there, but I can't get back because it's outside of the regulatory provision of ADA. But my house is always within the ADA. So it's, I know that from personal experience, actually, unfortunately. Josh?
Just as a quick question on that, since we're lucky enough to have the vendor from that area, I believe some time ago there was the offering of extended service that would double that. Is that still on the table, or was that discontinued?
I'm not familiar with the extended service. Do you know how long ago that was?
I'm getting old, probably about 2 years ago. No? Okay.
The only thing I can think of would be the Medvan service that we had, but I don't recall any extended service.
Okay. It used to be that you could pay double, and I know then cost becomes a prohibitive factor to actually extend that range, and that was a policy.
Well, that would be outside of the zone area. We do have people that are outside of the zone, like Discovery Bay, and they end up paying double, but then they have the same issue on the weekend as well.
Gotcha. So yeah, just we have cheated quite a few times in supporting folks, drive 3 city blocks or 1 city block or cross the street. I had a young lady that we served that literally she was 3/4 of a mile across the street. So we would make the rides for the corner that was across the street, and that's where she'd be picked up from. So.
Okay, I think we're now, let's see, Ralph spoke. Okay, so I think we're now done with item number 6, and we're ready for item number 7, which I'm sure you've all been holding your breath for, because it's Mala will present to us an overview of the Brown Act, and I'm sure with her presenting, it will be a treat.
You're kind. I'm happy to take questions as I speak, and to the extent you're jumping ahead of slides, I'll just let you know that it's coming ahead. But I'm going to be speaking on the Brown Act. It's quite intensive, but I'm not going to be speaking that long on it. I almost jumped in on your last matter, and you'll see why. But it's probably a good thing you don't have me at all of your meetings. Let's see. The Brown Act is found under the Government Code. It's 54950, and it's quite extensive. But what the Brown Act covers, and I'm going to give you a primer. I think some of you are probably very familiar with it, and others of you are most of you very familiar with it? Maybe I can get an idea. I'm seeing a lot of nods. Are there some of you who don't have that much information? Okay, so again, feel free to ask questions as I go on.
Can I start with the question about
absolutely.
what your item on the, can I guess what your item on the last?
Please guess.
We were getting off topic.
Yes.
Because I was about to call off.
And I said, I jumped up here, and then you immediately cut it off, and I thought, okay, good. And that oftentimes...
That was the reason.
Yes, exactly. That's why I jumped up. I wasn't trying to push you to my item, but you were starting to get off topic. And we'll explain as I go forward what that means and why I was wanting to encourage you to move on. The Brown Act requires that all of your meetings be available and open to the public, that all persons are able to attend unless otherwise permitted under the chapter. And we'll talk about various exceptions and how that really plays in for you guys. It applies to various bodies. The governing body in this case is the Authority Board of CCTA, and then it applies to the various appointed bodies such as the PCC. And then standing committees of the authority are the Planning Committee, the PC, and then the APC. It applies to those committees. Standing committees are less than a quorum of a board that meet on a matter of continuing subject matter jurisdiction. If you have less than a quorum of a board that meets on a limited subject matter jurisdiction, it's called an ad hoc committee. Those are not subject to the Brown Act. So often we'll get the question, are we an ad hoc committee, hoping that that's the case. And then it applies, let's say, I'll use an example of a council member who's recently elected but hasn't assumed office. It applies to those recently elected officials who haven't yet assumed office. So it applies to meetings, and meetings can often be construed as this type of situation, obviously, where you have a quorum sitting to listen, hear, discuss, or deliberate any item that's before your jurisdiction, which is the PCC. But it doesn't require you to actually take action on an item. So I'll often have people tell me, but we didn't take action on it. We just discussed it. And that is subject to the Brown Act. Just discussing an item that's before your jurisdiction can be a violation of the Brown Act if it's not properly agendized. And we'll talk a little bit more where this comes into play. I think people are pretty good about knowing that when you're physically together and you've got a quorum, being careful about what you're talking about, but I often see problems with email and other electronic means that can create inadvertent violations. The Brown Act requires that you give notice of your meeting. So we have agendas. We say that we're going to meet at 2 o'clock. We're going to meet here at CCTA offices. We list the address. And then we have to give brief descriptions of each item that you're going to be talking about, including potentially closed session items. So the descriptions can be brief, but they have to allow the public to know what you're talking about and allow them to know that, okay, this is an item I might want to come and listen to and participate on. If it's a regular meeting, we have to give 72-hour notice. So your regular meetings are at 2 o'clock on the third Monday every other month. So we have to give 72 hours notice of those regular meetings. We have to put those on if we have a website, which we do, we have to post that on our website. We also have to post it in another accessible manner that's accessible for the full 72 hours during prior to the meeting. Special meetings are meetings that occur outside of your regular schedule. So if for some reason you needed to hold a meeting before your May meeting, that would be considered a special meeting, and you only have to give 24-hour notice. So it's much faster period. It doesn't apply to every single action or interaction you might have. So if you have members of the public who contact you, that is not subject to the Brown Act. If a quorum of you go to a conference or a seminar, that's not subject to the Brown Act. Again, you can't be sitting together and talking about PCC business at lunchtime. That would be a violation of the Brown Act. But if you're just sitting at the seminar or the conference, that's not a problem. Community meetings where a quorum of you is not a problem. A quorum for you is 8. So just keep that in mind. It is the majority of the sitting members, and so I think there are 15 sitting members. So that might shift over time if more vacancies are filled. Yes.
So in this case, we have alternates. So if they're alternates or there's somebody from the agency, does that come into play or no?
Yeah, I think it does come into play. I would be careful about that. Are you thinking so you could have alternates sitting with, in theory, are your alternates specific to a member?
Yeah, and I'm not talking about mine specifically, but Tri-Delta, if the County Connection and Tri-Delta and WestCat and AC Transit and I and a couple of other members were to be having a meeting on something totally unrelated to this, but related to coordination of transportation, that's an issue we'd have to be aware of.
Right, and if the alternate and the regular member are there together, I would only count the one. Yeah, exactly. But if the regular member is not there, but the alternate is there, then that's where you would need to count the alternate. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. It doesn't count for ad hoc committees. We talked about that. And then this one it also doesn't count for. If you go, for instance, I recognize some of you from the CCTA Authority Board meetings. If you, let's say, went to the TEP special meetings and a quorum of you sat in the audience, that would also not be subject to the Brown Act. Again, you can't be sitting in the audience and then talking about PCC issues. But if you're just in the audience and participating, speaking at public comment, that is not subject to the Brown Act. So this is what I started to reference in terms of serial meetings and where there can be problems. A serial meeting is a series of communications that take place that relate to hearing or discussing or deliberating on an item that would be otherwise before your jurisdiction. And it often comes into play with email. It can come into play just using the regular phone and calling people, but where I see it most often come into play is with email. Let's say staff were to send out correspondence from a member of the public to the full PCC, and one of you were to reply all and say, this is what I think about that correspondence, that would be an inadvertent violation of the Brown Act. And so what we often recommend in that example is for staff to BCC the full commission, and so there's no accidental reply all. If you reply all and say thank you, that is not an issue, but it's the reply all that says, this is what I think about the letter, I don't agree, I think we need to analyze X, Y, and Z, that's the problematic situation. The same can happen with a telephone call. We call the two types of serial meetings that happen the hub and spoke and the daisy chain. The hub and spoke is when one member from the commission starts calling a quorum one at a time on the board and starts talking about something that maybe maybe you get your agenda packet and you start talking to a quorum of the commission and either telling your opinion or talking about items on the agenda. And then at that point, through the various calls, if you've hit a quorum, you've had a violation of the Brown Act. The daisy chain example is when Council or Commissioner A speaks with B on an item, and then B speaks with C, C speaks with D, and then you've ultimately got a quorum of the commission speaking or chatting about an item that is before your purview. So those are kind of the common occurrences. Social media, Facebook and Twitter can also be very problematic. So I don't know how active you all are on that, but that can be something to consider as well. Yes.
If in your email scenario, if somebody were to respond to all but said, can we agendize this, is that they're not giving their opinion on?
That's appropriate. Okay. So something that is permitted under the Brown Act is just kind of trying to coordinate. Let's say it's even like yeah, exactly. Getting a date together for a meeting and all of you emailing, I'm available on this day or that day, that's also okay. And yes, getting it on a future agenda is something that's permitted.
What happens when your daisy chain and Facebook get married?
So, give me your. I saw you looking.
Yeah,
and so
I and I Facebook a lot.
I almost was going to ask you, but I thought I would let.
Well, so
I'm Facebook friends with you, and I can see.
Right.
Okay, so let's say a quorum of you are
I don't
Facebook
express
friends.
opinions on Facebook.
Well, the rest of us do.
Yeah, but I don't, and that's the reason.
Right. So, and I don't. So, are you concerned that you may be giving your opinion on something that's before the PCC?
Not before the
Yeah.
PCC, but
So it needs to
certainly
be
I
within
talk
your-
about mobility and transportation and access and all kinds of things that
Right.
do get. That's why. So
Yeah.
maybe there's some blur.
There is some blur. I mean, obviously, if it's more generic, that wouldn't be an issue. But it's really, I obviously wouldn't tell you to ever be doing something on Facebook or promoting something that was on an agenda that, if you have a quorum that are also your Facebook friends or, have access to it.
Well, that's why I was saying the daisy
Yeah.
chain, because I may not be friends with a quorum of people on here, but if Rita sees it and comments on it, and somebody sees it who's
Right.
friends with her, I'm just saying.
Or if she shares
I was
it.
saying
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One example, let's say you're only friends with Rita on Facebook and you post something and then Rita shares it to her group because she thinks it's great and her group has a quorum, you can see where it could be a potential problem. So,
But I think that the only thing we talked about, to the general public on Facebook was Measure X. So I don't think we have to really worry. We were trying to get it passed.
okay, and so maybe you were just saying, please vote for Measure X.
And in that case, if you're actually trying to coordinate support of something that the committee of the board has actually accepted and promoted, that's acceptable.
Right, you've already taken action on it.
Because you're operating
right?
within the plank of your platform.
Right, and you've taken action in theory, right? Maybe, I don't know if did the PCC give I can't remember if there was like a recommendation of support. And so let's say you guys already took your vote of support, and then afterwards on Facebook you said, PCC is recommending, approval of the TEP and or PCC is recommending voting for Measure X. That's something you guys have already taken action. Now, if you did it in advance of that action, then that's where the problem could rise, where you could have.
So the place where that could theoretically have occurred, I think you were both on the advisory committee for Measure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you were doing it while that was active.
And you had, EPAC was a larger.
We weren't asking people for their opinions on the expenditure plan. That was not an issue. But this is good conversation to be having.
This is where
it would
it
have been
gets
really
tricky.
good conversation to have 9 months ago. But yeah, it's good conversation now too.
But I think basically anything that was said was after it had a label, Measure X.
Right.
Which means all the
action has
discussion
already
had
been
taken
taken place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
It's if you do it before, it becomes problematic. So yes, if you're already just
Yeah.
saying this is the platform and we're recommending Measure X or the TEP, then that's okay.
Right.
So there are some things that you can do that are not on an agenda, and some of them we've kind of already talked about. So let's say you get a comment from the public under public comment, and you want to give a brief response or a statement, or you want staff to respond to that. That can be done. Again, it needs to be brief. There's no time frame. It's not like after a minute or two it needs to get cut off usually, and someone will jump in, such as I was about to do in that example if you're getting off topic. If you have questions of staff to clarify an item that's not on the agenda, you can do that as well. I know that one of the commissioners had wanted to make some comments about something that they were involved in. While if it hadn't been on the agenda, I understand it's on the agenda later, but that could be done even if it wasn't on the agenda. If it was a brief statement, you can ask staff to bring back an item at a future agenda to discuss, and then items can be added if there's an emergency situation. So that's likely not going to occur here, but if there was an emergency that is a defined definition, then a majority of you could vote to add it to an agenda so that you could take action. And then if there's an item that needs, it's called urgency, it requires you to take action before your next meeting. Let's say something came to the attention of Peter after the 72-hour notice requirement happened, and you only meet as you do every other month, and you needed your recommendation or your approval before that May meeting, you could add it by a 2/3 vote by making findings. And then the other, yes?
Is the two-thirds of who's here in meeting quorum, or 2/3 of total membership?
It's a good question. 2/3 of total of your quorum. So if your quorum is 8, it would be 2. Yeah, exactly. And then if you, let's say you had a long meeting and you needed to end the meeting, or you're going to lose quorum because people needed to leave, but you could meet within the next 5 calendar days, then you wouldn't need to re-agendize the item. You could just carry those items forward to that next date. So opportunity, yes.
I was at a county meeting last week, so were you, where we were voting on the county, it was the Advisory Council on Aging, on their plan for the next year. And one of the members brought to our attention that if we had a quorum at the beginning of the meeting, we didn't need to quorum. We didn't need to take roll call again for the time when we voted, which was after the public hearing. And people would have left. He said that we didn't need to have a quorum then.
Well, you have to have a quorum for the entirety of your meeting. So I've had situations where I've had people like walk out because they needed to take a call or go to the bathroom, and I've all of a sudden looked and I realized we lost the quorum, and so we'll stop the meeting and wait till that person comes back in. And then I've also had situations where we know we're going to lose the quorum at a certain time, so we're trying to rush through the items to get everything done before that time, or at least get the things, the action items, because after that point, the meeting isn't there. So if only 7 of you were here, there would really be no more meeting of the PCC. It would have ended by the time that 8th person left. So you have to have the quorum for the entirety of the meeting. And so, you should be keeping track of it. And it happens where it's a large group, someone will walk in and out. But when you're barely making the quorum, someone should be paying attention if we're losing the quorum or not. And sometimes I've had the question, we're not going to have a quorum, but, we're not taking action on any item. We're just hearing various issues. Can't we just have the meeting? And then I will say, well, it isn't a meeting. It's just not a meeting without a quorum. So that's the short answer.
So just how do you frame that then? If a party of members gets together and hosts something where the public is getting input, but there's no quorum, is it just a gathering or an information session? Or
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes I will just tell you I wouldn't recommend doing it because it isn't a meeting of the group, but sometimes I know people will want to have the meeting because there are members of the public who came and want to get their opinion out. So yes, I would frame it as, well, we don't have a quorum, we don't have a majority of our board here, but we do recognize that members of the public are here and may not be able to attend when we continue this to when we have a quorum, so we're happy to hear what you have to say. Yeah, that would be what I would recommend.
And then when you do have a quorum, you would reintroduce what was said. The person doesn't have to be there.
You could, as
Introduce
yeah,
it to record.
exactly. I mean, if you had minutes taken, you could say, unfortunately, I would recommend asking the person to come at the, future meeting, but if they couldn't, you could say, exactly, we unfortunately didn't have a quorum, this person spoke and said X, Y, and Z. That would be, I think, a nice way to address that the public member couldn't be there.
And for that same reason, no minutes have to be taken because there is no meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't recommend taking minutes, but in that scenario we gave, it might be good to take minutes of what that person said if you wanted to introduce it. Yeah, technically no minutes need to be taken of any meeting unless you have that policy, but yeah, I absolutely agree. Don't take minutes of something that isn't a meeting. So we're talking about opportunity of the public to speak. So there's a public comment portion, which we had earlier, which is the portion of the agenda where members of the public can speak on items that are not on the agenda. And let's see. We don't require people to register when they want to speak. We often ask they fill out a speaker card, and the purpose of that is so we can make sure if we have minutes that we can spell their name appropriately, but if someone wanted to say that I don't want to fill my speaker card out or I don't want to put my address, they're not required to do so. They can just speak and not disclose their name or address. So again, they can speak on items of interest to and they can also speak on the specific agenda items. And when they're speaking on the specific agenda items, you need to allow them to speak before you take action. So it can be after the staff. Typically, I see a staff report given, and then questions from the commission, and then members of the public are asked to speak, just as Chair Abelson did today. And then it could also come back to the commission. But as long as it's allowed, members of the public are allowed to comment before you take action, that's appropriate. You can have rules of decorum. For instance, many agencies limit speaker time to no more than 3 minutes and have a timer. Oftentimes that's not necessary when there's not that many members of the public, but when it's a large crowd, it's often needed to be enforced. Yeah.
Is there any sort of guideline or general rule if you have a decorum rule of, let's say, 2 to 3 minutes and a person needs a reasonable accommodation due to, let's say, AAC usage or spasticity? For a longer period of time. So maybe the person has spasticity and it's going to take longer than, I've seen decorum as 1 minute before.
Yes, I've seen, I think, is it the county that does 1 minute? All right.
I will say assembly and Senate hearings too.
I know some counties, but it doesn't sound like Contra Costa, but I know some other counties who do 1 minute, which seems really short to me. But yes, absolutely, you should absolutely make a reasonable accommodation for someone who needs longer time. And then the Brown Act did, I don't know if it was this year or last year, recently, if you need a translator, you need to double the amount of time. So if you normally allow 3 minutes and someone is speaking in Spanish and they need, someone to translate for them, then you need to give them 6 minutes.
I'm assuming ASL isn't.
Give me a moment after the meeting and I'll check, because I thought it was specifically related to language, but I think it's a good rule of thumb, to be honest, for anyone who, we need to provide a reasonable accommodation separately, so it may even be, to be honest, longer than double, depending on the person's issue. But I think they said double for translation because it seemed reasonable to be able to translate in double the time. So I wouldn't say double if someone needed a reasonable accommodation. I would kind of balance it on what they need.
I'm just going to say, I'm sorry. This is non-topical and a violation of the Brown Act, perhaps, but it never, in my experience, in 15 years of testifying before the Assembly and Senate, have I ever seen them allot additional time for somebody with a translator.
Really? And so maybe that's why, that the law with the translation is new. and I'm trying to think if it's this year or last year. I'm seeing it. Let's see. At least twice the time allotted to a member of the public utilizing a translator, ensuring the non-English speaker receives the same opportunity to directly address the legislative body, unless simultaneous translation equipment is used. So that is a brand new law for this year. But it looks like it is relating to translation.
So if a person, a lot of times we have folks with severe spasticity that engage in what's called echoing. So it might actually be the person's native language or chosen language
Right.
is English, but to actually be, it's more of an interpretation versus translation. Are they synonymous in this case? Or?
Well, I think separately as a reasonable accommodation, you need to give them more time. And so that's why I was saying, while this is relating to translation and then saying double the time, I think in that scenario, you need to decide what's reasonable, and it may be more than double the time, depending on, how much echoing they're doing or what it is, what it is. So I think you just need to be reasonable about it. And I wouldn't want to tie it to double is what I'm saying, is you just may need to give more. Yes.
San Pablo City Council allows double time for translation.
Right, perfect. And I know you're a city attorney, so yes, it just seems, to be honest, before this law came into effect, it seems reasonable that you're going to need at least double the time to have a translator say exactly what you're saying. So some of this, I think, is just common sense, even if it's not in the law. I think you guys can realize what needs to happen. So the public can record meetings. I know we already record our meetings, but if a member of the public wanted to videotape the meeting or audio tape the meeting, they can do so. The only way an agency could prevent it if it showed that it was causing a consistent, persistent disruption of the proceedings. That can be very difficult to show. Obviously, if they were trying to set up in some way that was disruptive, that would be a way to do it. But most people set up discreetly and in a way that doesn't disturb the meeting. So in that case, you would need to permit that. I mentioned about closed session items. This is typically something that the authority board would consider, but just wanted to give you a broad overview. There are items on an agenda that can take place in private without members of the public sitting in on. A couple examples I've given that are more common, or if there's existing litigation, then the board will want to hear from their attorney and want to talk about strategy or issues in private. Obviously, you don't want members of the public hearing that. Another example is if you're doing a performance evaluation on your public employee, that's going to happen in private. You have to give a brief description. The Brown Act is very clear on what that is, and then if any action is taken in closed session, you need to report out in open session. So there may be times when you may want to teleconference into a meeting. The Brown Act does allow for teleconferencing. There are certain restrictions. You have to actually post the agenda in the same time frame at the teleconference location. The teleconference location has to be open to the public, so you can't be on your cruise ship saying I want a teleconference from my cruise ship, or you can't be in your car saying I want a teleconference from my car because it's not open to the public. So the public needs to be able to attend the meeting functionally at that teleconference location. That doesn't mean it has to be in Contra Costa County, so long as a quorum is in the county. I've had people teleconference all over the world, but it does mean it has to be, in theory, if someone was sitting, in Australia where you were teleconferencing and wanted to attend, they should be able to. The only other caveat on teleconferencing is all votes have to be by roll call. So typically, as you've seen here, you'll have, all in favor, yes, all opposed, no. But here you would have to actually name each commissioner with a yes or no.
Isn't there one other thing? That is, that it has to be in an accessible location?
Yes, and that was what I had mentioned earlier. It has to be accessible to the public.
I didn't mean it that way.
Oh.
I mean accessible based on disability.
Disability, yes. Yeah, accessible both in terms, yeah, you're absolutely right.
And do you have to have accessible bathrooms too?
I don't know. I haven't had that. I'm happy to follow up with you on that, but I haven't had that discussion. To be honest, the times I've seen it used, I don't think I've ever had anyone attend at that teleconference location. So sometimes you see someone is on a conference and they want to participate, and so they're doing it at that conference location, so there really aren't members of the public who want to attend, or it could be, at your house. And so you have to, I always warn people.
Right,
you have
but
to
if I, as a member of the public, say,
I want to
with a
attend.
disability,
Yeah.
I'm not really allowed to go to the site unless it is accessible, and it has to be, I can't just show up at the time of the meeting and hope that it will be accessible.
No, and we
And
typically.
in other places where I've heard this topic discussed, I've heard that does have to be taken care of, and in a number of agencies that I have something to do with, either as a member of some board or as a member of the public, they always post about it, the availability of accessibility.
Well,
issues.
we always on the agenda, and we're required to on the agenda post that, if you have, if you need something, you should let us know within a short period of time. Sometimes, I don't know what our agenda says, sometimes it's 24-hour notice or 48 hours notice. So sometimes if you need auditory assistance, that we can make that available. So that could be something that if someone were going to contact you, then we could try to make it available. But I will follow up on
But the thing about
facilities.
say wheelchair accessibility in particular, it either is or it isn't.
Right.
So you can't.
You can't change it, and so that is a good point. So I
you
can follow
can't,
up.
So I've always heard that it was
Prohibited.
that it had to be that way.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would want to double check is obviously let's say this meeting is accessible. So then the question that I'm thinking in my head is, does every location have to be accessible when we're providing at least one location that's accessible? But it is a good point. So that's what I want to double check, is that nuance, because if that was the only location, then there's no question.
That's the way I've heard it described
Yeah.
by everyone else, everywhere else.
Okay.
So if you open up for teleconferencing, so I call Peter and I say, I can't make it to this meeting, can I teleconference in? And Peter says, yes. Do you have to do it through an open call-in line then for anyone in the public that would want to? Or?
No.
Okay.
No, it's just that physical location has to be is open.
So where you call in from has to be open.
Right.
So if you're calling from your house, then you're going to have to allow people to come to your house. Or from a sailboat out.
Well, and that was why I was saying a sailboat isn't going to work, because it has to be something that people can, if you're on your cruise ship, for instance, people can't get on the cruise ship without paying for that. So that's why that's not an option. And then the chair was pointing out the other issues in terms of the physical accessibility.
I'm going to piggyback on something that was said. I understand why an individual wouldn't be able to call from their car, for instance. But what if that board member just wants to listen in and is not participating? Is that allowed?
I think I have not recommended it.
Okay.
Because we don't allow everyone we don't have a call-in line like you had indicated where people can, I think if someone wants to listen, aren't we live streaming? So we're live streaming right now.
I was thinking about a public meeting in which it isn't
It
normally
isn't live streamed.
Right.
Yeah, so I would counsel against it, because I think they're hearing it. And so that goes to the brand. And so I would suggest you either, if you want to participate and it's possible, sometimes it's not possible, as we talked about, or it's a little too complicated, then I would encourage you not to. And get the minutes, or get the, sometimes there's audio, but it's not live streamed, and hear it afterwards.
Sorry, one last question on that. So if I have a board member, if a member of this board, as a function of their disability, needs to call in, does that then open up their home or wherever they're at? They have to meet that same compliance, or is it considered a reasonable accommodation for that person? Let's say they're having a wheelchair problem, or they've had a high seizure activity that day.
It's a good question. I know of circumstances where members of a board have become ill. They may not have had the disability to begin with, but they have become ill, and so they're either in the hospital or they're, at home. And I know For instance, in the circumstances of the hospital, they haven't been able to provide the access because members of the public just can't come into the area where the individual is. So that hasn't been an option. It's just been an impediment. I don't know. I mean, I think the house situation gets complicated to the extent, I think, the issue that the chair mentioned in terms of accessibility is if let's say your house isn't accessible, and that is going to be required, then that would be, I think, a complication, and I'm not sure about that. I can look that up if that's an issue. I think the nature of these questions, because I think the nature of what you do are not been questions I've typically heard, so I appreciate these because it's brought up new issues, and I can follow up with you on that because I think that is a scenario that could happen.
We actually had this happen at not our last
Right.
meeting, but
Two meetings
ago, whereas one of our new board members, who this was going to be his first board meeting, had broken both of his kneecaps, and he was in a rehab
facility.
But he wanted to participate in the meeting, so we had him teleconference in. We posted the agenda at the rehab facility, all according to the Brown Act, and it was available for people to go there and participate in the meeting. And I guess it worked okay.
Yeah, and that's the scenario I think I'm a little bit more used to is where someone has something occur to them and they still want to participate. But I think in your scenario, it sounds like they may have reoccurring issues, so there's no way they can participate unless they can teleconference.
But that was also a situation where we knew 72 hours in
Yeah.
advance, so we could post it there. If the person just became sick that day or was having
Yeah.
then they probably just couldn't participate, and it would just be a quorum.
Well, and that's why I want to double check, because if someone is routinely not able to participate, I think that goes to what you're mentioning is the reasonable accommodation, and if, what do we need to do in order to accommodate that, which is what I wanted to double check, which is very different from the scenarios I think we're used to, which is.
So in other words,
Yeah.
could there be a waiver under
Right,
accommodation?
right, exactly. Or just, to be honest, maybe they want to participate, maybe it's just easier for them to participate in that location on a consistent basis to avoid that concern. Yes.
I was not present at the last meeting because I had another conference I needed to go to in Las Vegas, and I'll be reporting on that later. So I could have teleconferenced.
So in that scenario, that you could have, if we knew 72 hours in advance.
Right.
And so the issue there is your room. So let's say you were going to let's say you're at whatever, Hotel X, room 232. We need to know that at least 72 hours in advance, and then we would post that on the agenda, and you would have to post that 72 hours in advance on the door.
Okay.
But yes, in theory, that's how we would do it, and then we would roll call vote, and you could participate by phone.
Okay, thank you.
Sometimes a lot of that concern is the knowing you have to be there 72 hours in advance to post things, and that may not be the case depending on your conference. So you can also have off-site meetings. You have to post as well, either 24 or 72 hours in advance. Again, it has to be accessible to the public, and then it needs to be within the boundaries of the jurisdiction with certain exceptions. And we're at the end, actually. If you have a violation of the Brown Act, you always have an opportunity to cure. So if for some reason you did start talking and take action on an item that wasn't on the agenda and someone sent us a letter saying you violated the Brown Act, we always have the opportunity to cure the violation. So we could actually agendize that item at a future meeting and redo the discussion and redo the action. So that's the positive thing. If a violation is taken, it can be a misdemeanor for the member if they intended to deprive the public of information which they knew the public was entitled to. You can get lawsuits. Someone can bring a civil action against the agency or the individual, and then there can be also criminal actions. And that's
We do have a member of the public who would like to speak on this
okay.
item.
Great.
I'm just wondering if this might not be an okay time to do it since we've been having so much dialogue the whole time.
Sure. I think there was one other question.
Yeah,
I don't know if you wanted
Yeah, I
to
was
fill
gonna
the
come back,
questions.
but
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
was just going to come back to that if that's okay, and let the public speak. Okay.
Ralph Hoffman again. I have 3 points, and I'd like to get them all spoken in 3 minutes. First of all, it's important to call this the Ralph M. Brown Act. It has nothing to do with Governor Brown or Pat Brown or anything like that. Not just because of my name is Ralph. But the second point that I have is if a person is so disabled they cannot speak at all, they are allowed to use sign language and have a sign language interpreter who can speak out whatever this person is saying in sign language, and they have, I think, 6 minutes for that too. And the third point, I can speak, but I've forgotten the third point. Oh, yes. CCTV has, the last time there was a county-wide presentation on the Brown Act was in 2013. And depending on where in the county you live and what AT&T or Comcast or whatever network you have for television, you can watch this presentation recorded at the Board of Supervisors chambers with Q&A. It's a lot longer than you all have time for here, but you can do this in your comfort of your home. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Michael?
Yeah, and obviously you can cure prior to taking the action. So like, for example, today you said we were starting to wander off. And we said, well, we need to tie that down. That obviously can be done without penalty as well, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Are there any other comments from the committee?
One other thing, if we're going to wrap it up, I just wanted to point out is, particularly if you're chair or going to be chair, one of the newer requirements of the Brown Act is, and I saw that done today, is that when you take action on an item, if someone abstains or votes no, usually, if it's unanimous, you can say it's a unanimous vote of the board. If someone abstains, then you would reference who actually abstained, which is what the chair had done today. But I just wanted to point that out, that's many people were already doing it, but it's a newer requirement, and I think it was because there's some quite large boards, much larger than this, that it can be difficult to know who voted against something or who abstained without actually calling that out.
And I don't see any hands up here. Is there any member of the public that would like to speak? Okay, I don't see any there. So we will move on to the next item.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can't get it's really good to get something on the Brown Act every so often. Things do change with that. Okay, the next item is the Service Review Advisory Committee report. And I'll start it out by saying that one of the things we discussed was we get a performance indicator report of all the different things like, how long people had to wait for their ride, how many complaints there were, all kinds of different things. Takes up a whole page. And one of the things that was noted was that there have been, it's been more negative than it has in the past. And one of the reasons for that was thought to be the fact that there's so much more traffic out there on the road in the service area, which is West County and Alameda County, parts of Alameda County, so that if there's a lot of delay on the freeway, then the paratransit vehicle can't get through either. So that was one of the reasons that was discussed. However, then there are things that cannot be explained that way too. So that was one of the things we talked about. And Janet, I need your help here because I'm forgetting. The things we talked about. You want to pop in, please?
The other thing that they talked about is they're doing a lot more splits with their drivers. So they're trying to look at what they're studying is what is the peak time people are needing rides, And so they have quite a few more drivers that are doing a morning shift, then a longer break in the afternoon, then coming back for the evening shift. They do say the drivers are happy with it. They've had fewer turnovers as far as drivers leaving. At first, they kind of thought that was going to be bad, but the drivers like having the break in between and that. So far, they're doing a lot more studying of when their peak times are and trying to serve the public at those times.
So, and the group meets every 2 months. Did you think of anything else that? Oh, the budget. They did pass the budget. There's a requirement from the, let's see, HCTC, if I got that right, the Alameda County equivalent to this group in its entity, like CCTA. And then they have an equivalent to this group, although they have consumers on it as opposed to other people. It's pretty heavily, or if not completely, I believe, consumers. So it's a little bit different. But anyway, they have a lot of oversight required by their sales tax measures that have passed, and they actually do put a lot more money per unit. I'm not sure what the unit is, but let's call it dollars. I know the dollars they put in a huge amount of dollars compared to what we put in. So they have all these requirements. And so they have to fulfill those requirements, and they have to get their application in. I'm talking now about the Service Review Committee, I guess. And they have to get it approved before they can get that money. So that is a process we go through every year. And are there any questions? Okay, then we'll move on to the next item, which is the Senior Mobility Action Council report. Is anybody? Okay, Rita?
Yes. The main thing that we're talking about now and at the Senior Mobility Action Council meetings is now that Measure X failed, where do we go from here? That's really a biggie for us. Debbie also attends those meetings, so she can do some input. But also on September 29th, that's our tentative date, we're going to have a transportation event. We do one every 2 years. So we're going to start putting that together also. Debbie?
Yes, so we also provided an update that we attended the Board of Supervisors TWIC meeting to also raise the question to them, the Transportation, Water, and Infrastructure Committee, that in the absence of Measure X, we expect that there's something done as the need, because the measure didn't pass doesn't mean the need doesn't exist, and it does, and we want to see that the county is, and the Transportation Authority, but at that point I think we were talking to the county, that the county needs to come up with a plan, whether it's working with you, whether it's doing a study, whatever that answer is, that something still needs to be done. And so the Senior Mobility Action Council had asked the Advisory Council on Aging, it's the Transportation Subcommittee of the Advisory Council on Aging, had asked the Advisory Council on Aging to provide a letter to the Transportation, Water, and Infrastructure Committee stating that this need is still here and we want a response and we want some support in moving forward on doing something to address the need. And so we reported out on that. We're trying to do a quarterly newsletter for SMAC, so we're always looking for articles. So that's something that if people have something that they want to write about, this is an opportunity for people to get senior issues, disability issues, transportation accessibility issues in a newsletter that we're distributing through this group. And then we did discuss in the absence of Measure X that we need Peter Engel to attend our SMAC meetings more often. That was specifically discussed.
That's right, I remember that.
And I was supposed to write something up. I did a little draft about putting something together so that we're not just going to Transportation, Water, and Infrastructure Committee, but also to the CCTA full board, and also that we're hitting all of our city councils and everybody we can to say, hey, this need still exists. What are we going to do to address it? Just because the measure didn't pass doesn't mean that the need doesn't exist. And so something needs to be done, and that is what our focus is going to be. And as an advisory body, we can advise and we can educate, and we need the other bodies to act, and sort of talking about what that action plan looks like. So a lot of energy and effort on that, and we would invite anybody and everybody who has thoughts and suggestions to attend the next SMAC meeting, which is on Monday, a week from today.
I have a question for you. You said as an advisory committee, who do you advise?
The Advisory Council on Aging is the primary body, and the SMAC is a subcommittee of it. So the Transportation Committee is called SMAC, Senior Mobility Action Council, because it's cute, right? So, so SMAC, they're a subgroup of the Advisory Council on Aging, who is supposed to advise the Board of Supervisors on issues pertaining to the aging population in Contra Costa County.
Okay. So any other questions? Not seeing any. The next item is future agenda items for our next meeting. Does anybody have any suggestions of anything? Debbie?
In the absence of Measure X.
What?
In the absence of Measure X, I think we need to have that conversation. What's being done? What are the transit providers doing? What barriers do we face? I mean, I think we need to, we have a tremendously growing aging population. The state of California has a higher disability rate than any other state in the nation, and we should be examining whether or not we have appropriate services to meet the needs of the people in our...
So who were you wanting to do this report?
I don't know. I'm not volunteering if that's what you're asking, but I think that we do need to figure out how we address that issue, since that's our purview. I don't know what it looks like, but I definitely think that we need to explore if we have a role in that, what our role is.
Who's we?
We, the Paratransit Coordinating Council.
Okay.
Well, with our general counsel sitting right behind me, obviously we can agendize it. I think it's a discussion between the operators that are here and the nonprofit service providers that are here, and it would be up to you to, you're an advisory body to the authority. So correct me if I'm wrong, Mala, but the appropriate thing would be they would discuss it and decide if there's a question for the authority or action they would like the authority to take as a recommendation from them, and then we would move that through the authority process.
Okay, so I'd like to...
Could I just, before you make a motion, I actually thought what you meant was more looking at, say, operator X, whoever that is, no pun intended, and say to the operators, what are you doing now that you don't have Measure X? Are you doing something to try to fill in? I thought that's what you were saying, but maybe it wasn't.
I don't think they can. I mean, I don't think that there is an option for them to backfill money that they're not going to get from Measure X. I think more is what are we looking at? What are we really looking at in terms of need? In the absence of Measure X, what are we going to recommend to the Transportation Authority that they do? I mean, we went through a rather extensive process on the Expenditure Plan Advisory Committee to come up with some recommendations about what would happen in the senior and accessible transportation realm. And it was, in fact, when the entire Expenditure Plan Advisory Committee was polled on where additional funding needed to go, the single most important place was senior and disabled transportation. The most commonly occurring vote for increased funding was in this area. So there's this support, there's this recognition, but there's no action in place now. And so maybe it is an opportunity for us to look at that and maybe have a conversation about how we might articulate that, and that we would then advise the Transportation Authority to address the need. I don't know.
Just a suggestion regarding timing. So in May we have the claims. We had also discussed having the operator kind of give an overview of funding for general paratransit and some of the operators, and you had also thought funding for, you know, some of the nonprofit agencies that are providing accessible transportation. So maybe we can kind of do a, 20 or 30-minute thing that covers both those, so people have an idea of what the funding level is out there, and then that could lead into May, June, July, our July meeting having a larger discussion about the kind of the big picture of things as far as how these agencies are funded and what the needs are and the growing needs and how to start moving that forward. Just a thought, because I think that's a big discussion, and to cram it into May is going to be difficult, and we have to do the claims in May. And I think the funding stuff will kind of help set a picture for how you want to move that forward.
Okay. So anything else that anyone would like? Yes, Josh? Or who else had their hand up? Oh. Okay.
Madam Chair, as just, I was going to add it at the very end, but I think it fits to maybe a request for a future meeting item. As of late in our operations, we've been, I won't say besieged, but we've been getting an increasing number of calls from my stakeholder group about what can really be basically surmised into best practices, the need to maybe explore and have operators discuss their best practices on clear and concise communications with their riders and flexibility within the systems that they offer. An example of this was about 3 weeks ago. One of our community members was it was a rainy day. She was about an hour and a half in waiting for her paratransit ride to pick her up. Every time she would call, it was, we'll be there in 15 minutes. I stayed with her personally for another hour and a half. So she had a 3 p.m. pickup. Every about 20 or 30 minutes after that 15-minute window expired, we would call, and we were told 15 minutes. So she didn't feel comfortable going into a local coffee establishment or anything to get out of the elements because she was afraid she was going to miss her ride home. So again, clear and concise communications.
Isn't that something more addressed with the operator in question, not with?
But maybe establishing a threshold for best practices amongst all the operators. Another example is we have I have another stakeholder that uses a daily transfer ride between two of our operators, and there have been several occasions where the second operator picking up the passenger from the first operator didn't arrive within the 3 to 5 minute window, so operator one took the passenger back home and they missed their day. So again, I think it can be broadened to maybe a general ask or a discussion on what are the best practices in place surrounding clear and concise communication with your ridership.
As a writer, I would phrase it differently a little bit. It's being, I think the words are clear, they're just wrong.
Concise.
Yeah.
Honestly, and again, the final example I would give is just today, we had a stakeholder that was trying to come to this meeting, and he wasn't able to operate his wheelchair. And instead of the driver calling in or offering to bring the person in, they waited 3 to 5 minutes and then took him home. So he actually wasn't able to be here today as a function of his disability.
I didn't understand. Could you explain
So
that again?
I have a stakeholder that actually wants to join this group, wants to attend and make the 3 and become a central representative. His paratransit provider came here. He actually wasn't able, incidentally in the moment, to drive his chair. And without any form of outreach to Peter or the office. There could have been some sort of flexible the need to communicate. This gentleman right at this moment can't drive. I didn't receive a phone call. Nobody came in and engaged CCTA, and they just took him home. So I got a call saying he arrived safely back at home.
I'm sorry, Josh. Are you saying that they were here?
I believe they were right out front shortly before the meeting.
I had one of those incidents
And the guy was
somewhere recently.
I don't believe that. That's hard to believe. That actually happened?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I don't know about that one, but
So I guess in getting back on topic, I'm suggesting for a future before
what is the agenda item? So what is the agenda item?
Madam Chair, I would leave it at your discretion to rephrase it, but maybe just something
I would
about
suggest it has to do with
promoting
operating
coordinated
procedures
communication.
or whatever, not wording. I think
Absolutely.
the wording is clear in those situations. You don't get a ride, that's the answer, or you don't get off, or whatever. But I don't think there's anything unclear about that. But what the issue is, perhaps, is more the operating, the operations, and but that's what. So I'm suggesting, if you don't mind, that be more what the agenda item is about. If
I would
that's
love it.
Okay, how about you, Debbie?
We have multiple stories to share in this regard.
Madam Chair, may I just chime in on this? But I think, though, that Josh has a good point in terms of coming from this commission. If we're an advisory commission, I think we can or should be able to set some parameters of operation that could be a guide for each of the operators across county lines. I think that's a good point that I think we should look at.
I think we're beyond the, that's not under the guise of agendizing items, I think, but we could, unless you're wanting to say something that would be, did I do that right?
well, yeah, I mean, I think we're also getting beyond the scope of the PCC
Yeah.
when it comes to operating rules. Now, I'm gonna have to think. I can't just, I'm gonna have to, talk to you, Madam Chair, and maybe our attorney, and see if some of these issues are outside the scope of our committee. I mean, some of them are operational issues, and are they operational issues because some of the operators are very strict to ADA and some are more flexible, so some have more flexible operating scenarios than others, and it just gets, it's getting very complicated. So I think we need to, look at this from that perspective and see what it is that we can talk about from the PCC's perspective, and maybe make
So that
suggestions.
maybe could be the opening for this,
Yes.
whatever level of discussion
Yes.
occurs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, from
Okay.
again, I'm sorry, from my standpoint, at our last meeting, I raised the question of what's the charge of this commission? And Peter, you were to get the bylaws of this organization, because as a new member, I don't really know what our charge is. And it would help me in this kind of conversation that we're having right now to know what that is, what that mission is.
Maybe, Peter, you could get it to all of us? Do you communicate with all of us by email? So maybe you could just email it to us? Is that okay with everybody? Mm-hmm. Okay. And is it on the website? Or is that a place where you put things like that?
I'd have to look. I don't think the bylaws are, but we can certainly email them out.
I'm just thinking if the public wanted it, how they would get it.
They might be on there. I'd have to look and see.
If they're on our mailing list?
If they're on our mailing list, then
Okay.
they could get them.
Okay, so,
But we can look at putting them on the website. That's not a problem.
okay,
They might, like I said, they might be on there. I'd have to look and see.
okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so do we have enough items? I think so. Debbie?
Just as a point of clarification, as you and Madam Chair and the attorney discuss related to what our purview is, I would question whether or not best practices for those receiving Measure J funds is the right context in which to put that.
Okay, so the next item on the agenda is just to mention that the next meeting is on March 20th. Well, wait a minute, that's today. Do we want to correct that maybe? Would it be maybe some date in May? It has today. May 15th, okay. At 2 o'clock in this very room. And then is there any news to share from the committee members? I think this is where Josh, you wanted to say something. If you,
I think, Madam Chair, you indulge me in being able to share the situational requests that we've had from our stakeholder group for a future topic.
Okay. And we'll discuss it, as I understand it, in more depth when it's agendized, as it should be, right? We're learning. Okay, anybody else have news to share? Michael?
I do want to follow up on my reason for not being here the last meeting. I had a conference in Las Vegas because I'm an officer in the California Teachers Association, and we just happened to have the conference on that weekend. But what I'm going to share with the group is the paratransit that I received from the Southern Nevada Transportation Authority was absolutely incredible. You know, Tri-Delta called ahead, as the procedure goes, that we're entitled to use paratransit, anywhere around the nation. And they did it, I think they have to do it like 72 hours ahead of time. And when I got there, what I did was I took the train and the bus. And the Amtrak bus dropped me off at one of their transit centers. And the paratransit arrived, within the time frame that they told me, and provided me with service, during the 5 days I was there, and then also getting back to the transportation center. And it was a really good experience. And I think that we should share with people that they do have this right, that you can go to other areas like that and use the paratransit service of those localities.
Anybody else over here have anything on this side? Okay, we're adjourned.
Madam Chair,
Uh-huh.
I have one thing to add.
Okay.
We will email Mala's presentation out to all of you so you have the slides that show all about the Brown Act.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mala, for coming. I think we all enjoyed it.
We all learned.
Yes.
And we're all frightened